I'm taking a look at the effectiveness of school voucher programs to mitigate racial segregation in New York City public schools. We take a look at the programs themselves, the issues with them, and some alternatives. So we're going to start with some terminology that we're using here. High performing versus low performing. I realize that saying something like low performing is particularly withering for students. And I'm really just using this for lack of a better term. It's mostly related to test scores, which is an increasingly less valued metric and isn't meant to be a reflection of the students themselves. And it does show up in the literature. So that's sort of where we're coming from with that. Specialized high school, that's a specific type of high school that is usually valued for academic rigor and for college readiness. And it does require admissions testing, which is an important element there that's going to come up later. Relating to race specifically, the terminology we're using is Black and Brown, referring to Black and Brown students. The reason for this is because the segregation in New York City specifically impacts Black and Latino, Latina students. So using terms like person of color, people of color isn't very accurate in this context because of the sort of complex racial dynamic for Asian students that we see in New York City. We see it play out that way, and the focus for the scope of this, presentation is focusing specifically on Black and Latino Latina students. And also this is the naming convention that does exist in literature and in media as well. And then segregation, when we're talking about segregation, it's always going to be referred to de facto segregation, and we'll get into why for that as well. So we'll start with the research question. Can school voucher programs substantively reduce de facto racial segregation in New York City public schools? One of the ways we're going to sort of take a look at this is through the subfields of public policy and comparative politics. So moving right along to our thesis statement, the answer ultimately is no. School voucher programs don't desegregate schools or lead to equitable education opportunities for Black and Brown students. Policy on education equity should focus instead on alternatives, addressing racism in admissions, testing, and funding. So going with an overview of the issue and of the proposed solution of school voucher programs, taking a look at first with racism in New York City public schools. So very, very brief history of school segregation in the city. We can't really have a conversation about school segregation in the country at large without mentioning Brown v. Board, 1954 landmark Supreme Court decision that declared segregation in schools by race unconstitutional. Then skipping ahead and zooming into local New York, the community control movement. This was a push in the late 60s by Black school leaders in predominantly Black neighborhoods to sort of take the city to task and demand decentralized control of the schools. They essentially wanted to be able to take care of their own students. And at this point, they're really past the point of looking for school integration. They didn't really care whether or not there were white students integrated with the Black students. All they cared about was making sure that the Black students had positive education opportunities, which I think that's something that, a lot of the literature does agree that the goal is to provide positive education opportunities for everybody. It's just a question of how. And then, zooming way forward in the future from there, Mike Bloomberg, 2002, becomes mayor of New York City. The reason why this is significant is because he essentially set up the modern Department of Education. So if we're looking at modern education policy, we're going to need to sort of look at that as a turning point. He also opened up access to public charter schools, which is not quite, but sort of in the same spirit as school voucher programs. And he continues to be an advocate for school vouchers and school choice in general. So he's an important figure in that history as well. Then going to more modern times, 2012, progressive education activists formally began to protest against admissions tests to specialized high schools. They cite abysmal acceptance rates of Black and Brown students and say that white and Asian students have better access to test prep, better opportunity, and that's why, and that is reflected in the data. And their demands are basically for more holistic metrics for admissions instead. So looking to today, not a whole lot has changed. New York is still largely understood as having some of the highest rates of racial segregation in schools across the country, especially for its size. During the pandemic, we saw increased inequity all over the place, especially in schools. One of the things was this sort of technological divide. A lot of Black and Brown students who were given remote education, didn't have access to as much technology, including laptops, Wi-Fi, that sort of thing. And still, there's an enormous racial disparity in specialized high school admissions. One example that's pretty salient and keeps getting cited, and this is from 2019, that only 7 Black students were accepted into Stuyvesant High School, one of those specialized high schools. The reason we're looking at 2019 is because this is before the pandemic sort of threw off the status quo and our understanding of how schools operate. So even when things were, quote unquote normal, there was still rampant segregation and inequity. And this is just a pretty stark example of that. So school choice as a solution to racial inequity in schools. The idea behind these programs is that low-income families are offered public money to make tuition payments to private schools, largely private schools, because they're a little more well-funded because of these tuition payments, are understood to be a little bit more high-performing. Or if it's not money related, these families are offered admissions to schools that they otherwise wouldn't have access to, either because of school districting or because of high demand. Sometimes they have a lottery system that saves, preserves some amount of seats for low-income families. And it's not just low-income families that are getting these programs, it's specifically targeting Black and brown families as well. That's sort of part of the idea, is that it's meant to do this sort of racial integration, one family at a time. Whether or not it does that quickly enough or does that effectively enough is part of the question here. So one of the reasons that people like this idea is that the status quo does remain the same. So those who benefit from the education system as it is don't have their worlds turned upside down. And ultimately it's supposed to encourage students, really everybody, but specifically Black and brown students, to work hard toward education goals. That's one of the things that some of the proponents of the system really like. So moving ahead to literature review here, the literature is really split on the benefits and detriments of school voucher programs. Those who like the idea of school vouchers say that some integration is better than none. They say that those who do get school vouchers have good, positive academic outcomes. So if we're gonna be providing for any students, then that's a positive thing. And also it's in research that includes parents, it is largely popular among them because parents like to be able to choose what's best for their kids. Those that claim that the school voucher programs are not so great, that would argue against them. One of the things they say is that they don't do much for racial integration or academic achievement. And a lot of the literature, even the literature that supports the voucher programs, a lot of what they're hinging on in terms of data and analysis of both academic achievement and racial integration, it's pretty tenuous. So it's a little bit more convincing to believe the folks who say that the integration is not quite working. So one of the other things, so that's at best, the school voucher programs don't work, but at worst, there's a lot of detriments. One of the issues is that most Black and brown students are left out because only some are targeted. And what ends up happening is this false narrative gets created that because these families have access, theoretically, to school vouchers, they should be able to get good education for their students. And it's a really reductive argument, but it certainly is co-opted by a lot of sort of more right-leaning politicians who look at school voucher programs as a way to say that there's an equitable system, but without really providing a lot of funding or creating policy that actually definitely 100% leads to equity. And then also there's this, again, because it maintains the status quo, like we said before, the proponents like that about it. This status quo of high performing, low performing schools is maintained. And again, if the goal is to have every student be given a quality education, the idea of low performing schools shouldn't exist, right? Ultimately it should be about all schools being positive. One of the through lines of the dissenters who don't like school voucher programs is this issue of universality, that the best programs are universal. So specifically targeting certain groups, even if they are groups in need of opportunity for education. That's not the best way to go about it. The best way to go about it is to provide for everybody. And again, the supposed benefits of school vouchers for both academic achievement and racial integration are just not very convincing. So zooming in a little bit more, getting a little more detailed on the two perspectives, from the progressive side, you've got this idea that the real issue with school segregation is not or there is a real reason for it. It's admissions screening. The reason is that you've got these tests that they consider racist, and that a solution is to revamp the admission system and eliminate tests like the SHSAT, which is the admissions test for the specialized high schools, which again results in mostly white and Asian students passing and getting into these schools, and Black and brown students are largely left behind. They also point out that voucher programs essentially just do a bad job with needs assessment for these target populations, and again are missing a lot of people who also need access to education, or good education. So if in doing that, you're not doing much for racial integration at that point. And again, this idea of universality, the best way to do it, instead of giving some amounts of money to individual families, ensure the entire system, this is their perspective, ensure the entire system is robust and that all schools are performing well. And then you don't have to worry as much about certain students and certain demographics falling behind. And ultimately that will, they say, lead to better equity as well. So then contrasting that, there's this more traditionalist perspective, these are folks who say that the status quo is not to blame, that really what you should be doing if you want Black and brown students to succeed on these admissions tests, or in schools in general, is to give them the tools, give them what they need to achieve in the system. One of the real loud voices of this is John McWhorter, who some of you, I don't know if you've read his more recent book, but he's a real critic of critical race theory and all these ideas that Black and brown students need policy targeted toward them, and they should be able to be empowered to achieve in school on their own. And that's sort of his point there. And then one of the other things, again, you have this sort of like better than nothing argument that school vouchers do something for integration. So there's something to be said for that, which is true, but it's something that, you have to look at the numbers, and if it's not that many, then that's not great. So then the other thing is that parents who, it's largely popular amongst lots of parents in a lot of the literature that exists, they should be able to choose what's best for their kids. And again, they largely like these school choice, school voucher programs. So some suggested research methods, ways that we can get a little bit more information, defend this thesis that the school voucher programs are not very effective in providing racial equity, specifically in New York City. So starting with some of the challenges of researching this is, again, because there is this already kind of relatively robust past research on voucher programs. How do you create research that is actually different? Because again, a lot of the literature that does exist doesn't provide great evidence that they work. Even the folks that conclude that the voucher programs are positive when it comes to racial equity or academic achievements, the evidence that they supply is middling at best. Yet people still seem convinced that the voucher programs are functional. So what's the point of just sort of doing more of the same research? And then if you were to implement a more experimental voucher program policy, that's going to be something that's pretty difficult to implement. And you also got this issue of a long time frame. You want to look at school integration over years. And as an academic year is a whole, it's a whole year, it's going to be difficult to spend the time to be able to really look at that. So one of the things that is sort of an approach is this sort of comparative analysis. So we can take two different school systems, probably in two different urban centers, could be both in the US, could be across national borders. And you take places that have similar racial demographics and identify one that has voucher programs, and identify one or something or a similar program on maybe perhaps under a different name. And then look at one that doesn't have those and see how racial equity is dealt with. If one is more equitable, one is more segregated. And then another important thing, again, to differentiate between this and some of the research that does exist already, is to add another school program or school system that has a different program for racial integration outside of the school voucher program. And again, testing these sorts of alternatives is one way we can sort of get a sense of, if school vouchers don't work, what does work? And so looking at these alternative policies a little bit more closely, going off of that sort of progressive argument of admissions being the root cause of this rampant racial segregation, specifically in New York City, is to look at a program that has open admissions, one that doesn't use admissions testing like New York City does. a side note there, recently New York City tried to get rid of, under the Blasio administration with former schools chancellor Richard Carranza, they tried to get rid of the SHSAT, and there was a huge uproar, particularly among Asian communities, again, who do fine with the high school admissions test. They didn't want to see it get taken away, so it never did. But we can look at a place that doesn't have these sorts of admissions tests, a school system that doesn't have these sorts of admissions tests, and see how that impacts racial integration there. And also taking a look at how they measure academic success, right? A lot of the critics of any sort of holistic metric would say, well, what do you do? If you don't have testing, if you don't have numbers, how do you know students are doing well or not? How do you know if they are capable of achieving in the school or not, if you should accept them or not? So you've got to look at these programs that sort of avoid testing and get a sense of how they do measure academic success, and we'll have a better sense of alternatives to school vouchers. And then another thing too to look at that's a little bit less progressive, less in that progressive camp, is charter schools. So they're not the same as school voucher programs, but they're in a similar spirit because they do specifically target and are meant to serve Black and Brown students who otherwise are not given as much opportunity for positive education outcomes. And this is not dissimilar to what we saw with the community control movement in the 60s, right? In New York City today, you've got a lot of charter schools that are still largely racially segregated, that have large populations of Black and Brown students. But when you look at test scores, you look at college admissions, they do really well. These students do, so these are considered high performing schools. So there's something to be said for a program or policy where you have racially segregated schools, but the achievement and the education goals are positive for everybody. So that's one solution. And then, going back to the issue of integration, because that's really the scope of this, presentation here, is to look at if there are racially integrated charter schools. If there are charter schools with positive education outcomes that are also racially integrated, more so than the average New York City public school, then there is something to be said for that as a solution as well. So just wrapping things up here. So public schools in New York City are enormously segregated by race. There's different reasons for why from different camps. Some people say it's because of racist testing. Some people say there's other issues and that the school voucher program is a solution. But despite that, research supporting the voucher programs for both academic success and racial integration is really tenuous at best. And it's argued that they make schools more inequitable at worst. But there are promising and largely unresearched alternatives. So more research on things like open admissions and charter schools would certainly be valuable. Here's a look at some of the sources I used to get a sense of what school voucher programs are like, what the debate on school voucher programs are like. I mean, check it out. There's a lot to see. A lot to see. If you want to read more, you can. But you don't have to. I don't know. I'm not your boss.